Hey, this is S.A. Fourier here for Enspire Magazine at the Jazz Museum in Harlem. And we're getting ready to interview Vosa Rivers, a man with many titles. I literally have to read it off my phone. He is the first vice president of the Greater Harlem Chamber of Commerce, internationally known as a theatrical producer, and has additional responsibilities as executive producer for entertainment and cultural activities of Harlem Week. This man is one half of the brains and the power behind why everybody comes to Harlem to learn about Harlem. Vosa Rivers. I'm so excited to be sitting here next to you, Vosa Rivers. You know, this is the first time we've met. Enspire Magazine has actually covered a few events during Harlem Week. So thank you so much for your time today.
I am so thrilled and excited that 44 years ago, when a group of us got together to do a one-day event, that it would continue 44 years later. We're sitting here in the National Jazz Museum in Harlem, and there's a book on Harlem that covers that same period in the 1970s when we started. And when we started Harlem Week, Harlem was at its lowest ebbs. Wholesale abandonment of a lot of the properties that are here, businesses were closing, we had a drug epidemic, and people started moving out of the community. But for those of us who decided to stay under, at that point, the leadership of Percy Sutton, who was the borough president of Manhattan, who also lived in Harlem, we all talked about what would it take to get people to come out of their homes and celebrate, you know, the survivors, the people who said, I'm going to stay here no matter what. Right. And that's what happened for us. So on that third Saturday or Sunday, 44 years ago, we did a one-day event called Harlem Day, and that's the genesis and the foundation of what we do today.
Culture changes. So what have you noticed from the first time that you started Harlem Day to Harlem Week within the culture of Harlem? How has it changed?
The culture of Harlem has always been Harlem as a cultural capital of Black America. And during the turn of the century, when blacks were leaving the cotton fields in the South, the Caribbean islands, coming to this Mecca called Harlem, they brought their culture with them. Harlem is well known for the Harlem Renaissance, a very special period in our history. And that meant that the people in literary arts, the performing arts, the doctors, the professional people all started moving to this community. What Harlem Week does is it continues to capture and remind people on what this community contributed to the world. So it's not about a definition of how has Harlem changed. It, for us, in terms of the culture, is how do we keep our culture alive, which means past, present, and future. And so that's our goal, to do that. And for those of us who've been around, we want to make sure that they know that we really respect their culture. For the new arrivals, we want to embrace theirs. And we found a platform of integrating all of the different cultures that make Harlem a special community to live in.
Most people, when you think of Harlem, you think of African American community. Some people think of just rap for some reason. I don't know why, but I do know there's a lot of cultures, not just African American. There's some Cuban, some Spanish. You know, you have a lot of people who contribute to that culture, and you highlight that as well. And I think that's very important. And I want to know what made you reach out. How do you reach out to people to bring them in to Harlem Week?
Harlem Week has inherited, again, the reputation of Harlem being the cultural capital of the world. So when you mention Harlem and you think of the Apollo Theater and what that's represented for the last 70 plus years, and now you say Harlem or Harlem Week, there's a certain expectation that we're really capturing the nomenclature, the styles, the ambiance, the rhythms of a community that makes it so special. So for where we are today, with the international residents who have made Harlem their home, but even before blacks moved to Harlem, when the Irish were here, when the Italians were here, what we have been able to do is to incorporate all of the residents of this community. If one walks on 116th Street and they start at the East River, those Italians from the 30s and 40s are still living there. As you start heading west now, you have Mexicans and South Americans. As you continue west, you have the African community. There's Little Senegal there. And then you have the Euro community that's further west. This is an exciting time, and that's just one street in our community that is unlike a lot of other communities, and we're really proud of that. So we found a way to incorporate all of the cultures in this community because all have made major contributions.
You do so much, but what you're doing is what you love. I want you to talk about how did you start, how did you get into production? How did that start and lead you to where you are now?
I got involved in culture first. For me, it was in 1960s when it was at the height of the civil rights movement. A lot of assassinations had taken place, and I wanted to do something very simple. I wanted to take a public speaking course so that if I walked down these streets and someone said, "What do you think about what's going on?" that I could articulate in a very succinct manner how I felt about what I started to see happening in the community. So I enrolled in a public speaking class, and at that time there was a YWCA satellite program on 125th Street, and I visited that class my very first day, and there was a guest speaker by the name of Roger Furman, and he spoke about Harlem in 1940s. Now this is 1964. And he said that when he had gotten out of the service, he came to Harlem. He was living in New Jersey, and he joined a theater company called the American Negro Theater. And in that company was Ozzie Davis, Ruby Dee, Harry Belafonte, and Sidney Poitier, and others. And his area of expertise at that time was in the technical area. And that he, on the night that he was a guest speaker, was going to start his own theater company. And I listened very enthusiastically because he also mentioned that it wasn't just about being on stage, it was absorbing the history and culture of a community, and to be able to take that and share it with others. And so when he started talking, I got interested, and I joined the theater company that he was starting that evening. And for me, the rest is history. I volunteered because there was nothing that I wanted to do in theater at the time, but I said, well, if you need any help, I'd like to volunteer, and that's what I did for a number of years. And through that process, he taught me, he mentored me, told me how to focus lights, how to be a prop person, how to be a maintenance person at the end of the day, how to be in the box office, how to be a box office ticket taker, how to write proposals, how to negotiate contracts. All of that happened by me being a volunteer. When Roger died, and I was then asked to take over the theater. And at that moment, I was trying to find out, this is 20 years later, what is it that I could contribute built on the foundation that he laid down for 20 years. And a young man walked into the theater as an intern from South Africa who worked with Stephen Biko. And he shared with me the history of what was happening in South Africa and how we call it agit-prop theater, which means agitation. Agit-prop theater was a force in telling the story of the anti-apartheid movement, and that there was an opportunity for me to see up close these actors and how they perform. And I went and visited a production downtown in the village of 2 South African actors. And it changed my life because I had never seen acting like that before. I never saw storytelling like I saw there. And he introduced me to those two actors, and those two actors came to me and said, hey, man, it's great that you're here, but we've been here 6 months, and we've been selling out every performance, but we haven't seen any black people. What's happening? How come you guys aren't coming out to support us? I said, well, we're all uptown. We have our little theaters up in Harlem and elsewhere, and that's where we are. He says, well, why can't we go to Harlem? I says, well, you're here under a production contract. The producers who brought you into the country, those contracts are tied into the theater, and then when you're finished, you got to go back, because there was no reciprocity between our country and South Africa where there could be an artist exchange.
Right.
The guys pressured me and says, you got to find a way. You got to find a way for us to come up to Harlem. And I went to the producers, and we had an understanding that before those guys went back, that the producers would allow them to do whatever they wanted to do. And I brought them up to Harlem, and that's the beginning of the history for me, because I was able to represent what these guys did downtown, uptown. So the New York Times came out to see the play again, and they did a story from Soweto to the Village to Harlem, and they put it on the front page of the weekend section. And the people, and they only did 2 days with me, and the people from downtown came uptown, and the rest is history, because Joseph Papp, who ran the public theater, came up. Lucille Ortel, whose theater those guys were in, came uptown. The people that were heading up Lincoln Center Theater came uptown to see these guys, and it was like they were in South Africa when they came to Harlem. And we did that. They went back and wrote a second play, and they asked me to bring it to Harlem first before it went anywhere. I was placed on a blacklist, and I couldn't go to South Africa to see the play because of what I just did with them. So I was banned from going to South Africa. I listened to the rehearsals of these guys in South Africa over telephone, and I decided that I had to find a way to bring them into the United States, and I did that sight unseen. Harry Belafonte came to see the play, Paul Simon, Quincy Jones. A year later, the play went to Broadway. And I brought it into the United States, sight unseen, and for 5 weeks we sold out in my little 99-seat theater in Harlem. So that started me on another kind of trajectory, where I started seeing the potential of how theater can capture the voices and the nomenclature, again, I use that word, of communities, and how much we have in common, even when we don't all understand the language.
Again, it's more of a wealth of information and a testimony, to how hard you've worked and look what comes about it. You've literally, your struggle, your way had made way for somebody else. I think that's very important within our community of people, that we should know that you have to extend a hand in order to help. You have to extend a hand, and it from your story, it felt so natural. Like you weren't looking for anything in return, and that speaks volumes. And with that being said, that type of characteristic leads to, you have received numerous awards for a span of over 40 years and counting. You have many titles, roles, and contributing to the community of Harlem. What would be your advice to either a young creative who might be in a similar situation and, looking for that outlet? What would be your advice to them?
When I think about young people, I think about myself when I started. And Roger taught me by having me do. I use the same model with young people who are around me. Over the years, I've had a lot of interns, and what they've told me is that they were allowed to do everything. And I had that kind of confidence that this is the method that I wanted to use, because that's how I was mentored by this one person. I also was fortunate enough to be mentored by the Honorable Percy E. Sutton, who was the inspiration for us founding Harlem Week, where he allowed me to run his record label, Apollo Theater Records, for a number of years, and to actually form a partnership, a 50-50 partnership for an artist management company called Apollo Theater Artist Management, where I used to look at the stars coming off the stage of the Apollo. There were young people that I brought into sharing that experience with me, and it just, you never know what will happen, but now one of those young people is my son-in-law.
Wow.
And when he tells the story about what I allowed him to do and what he learned, it's just part of how I was brought up. And that's the experience that I would tell all young people. Go where you can be celebrated and not tolerated. Go where you will be challenged and given opportunity. There are a lot of things, but you also have to be open as a young person that this is something that you can see benefit from. And maybe initially you don't see it, but if you're exposed to more than one thing within an organization, you might find something that piques your interest, and you could now balance that with everything else that's being available to you. And eventually, not that you went in saying, I'm going to be this, I'm going to be that, but by the mere fact that you are being exposed may lead to other opportunities that you didn't even think about initially.
So you've given us so much wealth of information, a lot of history behind Harlem Week. We are still celebrating Harlem Week. I would love to know what do you look most forward to? Is there a particular day, a particular event, or performance that you look most forward to for Harlem Week?
You know, for Harlem Week, when people always ask, well, what's your favorite event? And what do you like most? I like the activities that we create and brand. Many years ago, Harlem Week created the National Black Sports and Entertainment Hall of Fame. That was followed by the Harlem Music Festival. Our most current branding is Harlem Havana, where we all went to Havana just when President Obama was there, and we walked away with an initiative called Harlem Havana. And for me, these are the types of things that are special. So this is the third year of Harlem Havana. We're at the National Jazz Museum in Harlem, and on Friday, we're going to be celebrating our cultures with the, and earlier you had briefly mentioned about the diversity of this community, and the Cubans have been here for a long time. And I can tell you that there are books done in the 1915, 16s, and 17 that has reference to the Cubans being a part of the Harlem Hellfighters, a band that toured Europe, but they had joined the military armory that's here in Harlem. That history and understanding that we've been able to know the history and then rebrand it for the different activities is what makes it new all the time. So we're recreating events and activities as we do what we do. When we talk about having a children's festival, or we're talking about all the themes that we have every year, those themes generate new ideas, new opportunities for us. And so this year, women transforming our world, the community within the community, the LGBT community, these things inspire, makes it exciting, and makes it fresh. And this is what I like most about Harlem Week.
That's awesome. So that's a wrap. It's S.A. Fourier of Enspire Magazine, and we just had a wonderful interview with Vosa Rivers here at the National Jazz Museum in Harlem, talking everything Harlem Week.